Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. You know how we do things here? We take one really juicy topic
Mm-hmm.
and we just go deep. Today, well, it doesn't get much bigger than this, right?
You know,
The agricultural revolution, that moment about 12,000 years ago,
yeah,
when humans went from hunting and gathering
totally.
to farming. Now, we know a lot of you, the learners out there, you're sharp. You've probably heard a lot of the standard explanations, but trust me, we've got something really special for you today.
Oh, yeah.
A new study published in, get this, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS. Along with this, we've got an in-depth research article titled, and I love this, Demographic Interactions Between the Last Hunter-Gatherers and the First Farmers. So we're going to kind of cut through the noise here, connect some dots that you probably haven't seen before, and trust me, there are some pretty surprising twists and turns in this story.
Yeah, it's a real page turner.
So let's set the stage, all right? For a long time, the dominant narrative, the one we all kind of picture, it puts a huge emphasis on the environment, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Climate warming after the last ice age, fertile river valleys, those lush landscapes just begging to be cultivated.
Right. Like, it just makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Humans see this opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
and bam, agriculture is born.
Exactly. And it's like this perfect recipe, right? You've got favorable conditions, and boom, humans naturally take advantage. And to be fair, that's a pretty compelling story. Even you've all know a Harari, Mr. Sapiens.
Yeah.
He kind of lays it out like that.
Right, right. Like, it was inevitable.
Yeah, inevitable almost.
Yeah.
But here's where things start to get really interesting. This new research, it challenges that kind of passive view of humans just responding to nature. They're saying, hey, maybe we've been downplaying the role of humans themselves. So
The human factor.
the human factor, exactly. The interactions between these groups, the hunter-gatherers who are already there, and those early farming communities.
Yeah.
They're arguing that these interactions were actually the main drivers of this whole shift to agriculture.
Mm.
And they're looking at things like population growth rates,
Mm-hmm.
competition for resources, who's got the upper hand, who's struggling. And they're even factoring in migration, people moving around, shaking things up.
It's so much more dynamic than that simple environmental picture.
So much more dynamic. And to get a handle on all this complexity, they didn't just dig up more artifacts. They did something really cool. They built a mathematical model.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets good.
But not just any model. They took inspiration from a surprising source, ecology. They borrowed a model that's usually used to study predator-prey relationships. Like how does a fox population affect the rabbits they hunt and vice versa?
Yeah, it's like that classic chase, right? One population's going up, the other one's going down.
Exactly. But how does that apply to, ancient farmers and hunter-gatherers?
Well, think of it this way. You've got two groups, both vying for the same resources, both trying to make a living. But they've got different strategies, right?
Right.
The hunter-gatherers, they're relying on what nature provides, right? Wild plants, animals.
And the farmers are transforming the landscape.
Exactly. They're planting crops, clearing land, which inevitably puts pressure on the hunter-gatherer's way of life. So the model allows us to see how those interactions might have played out over time, like whose population grows, who shrinks, and, does one group eventually displace the other?
Okay, I'm starting to see how that analogy fits. So what were the key factors that they plugged into this model, the specific ingredients that really made it tick?
So there are several really important parameters, things like the natural growth rates of each population. How quickly can they reproduce and increase their numbers just on their own? But then, crucially, they factored in mortality rates. But not just any mortality, what they called interspecific mortality. Now, this is a bit of a mouthful, but it basically means how the presence of one group impacts the survival of the other.
So it's not just about like direct conflict or warfare.
Yeah, no. It's much broader than that. It could be, farmers clearing land, reducing the hunting grounds for hunter-gatherers, or maybe they bring with them new diseases that the hunter-gatherers haven't encountered before. It's about the overall impact, the pressure that one group puts on the other.
Oh, I see. So like an indirect consequence.
Yeah, like an indirect consequence of their presence, exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So population growth, mortality, anything else they threw into the mix?
Oh, yeah, there's more. They considered migration patterns.
Yeah.
How much were these farming communities moving around, spreading into new areas? And here's a really cool one. They also looked at the possibility of assimilation, cultural exchange.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it wasn't just about one group replacing the other, but also about the potential for hunter-gatherers to adopt farming practices, maybe even join those communities.
So it wasn't a clean sweep, more of like a blending in some cases.
Exactly, a blending, a merging of cultures. And, one of the researchers, Dr. Javier Rivas, he put it really well. He said, this study gives us a new lens to view these prehistoric societies. And it shows how population dynamics, migration, this cultural mixing, they were all intertwined in shaping this transition.
It really adds a whole new layer of complexity, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just about, who planted the first seed.
Right.
Now, the research article itself, they describe this as a generalized mathematical model of demographic competition. And that got me thinking, does this mean this kind of approach could be used to study other historical shifts, not just the agricultural revolution?
That's a great question. And the answer is most likely yes. The researchers, they emphasize that this isn't just specific to farming. The principles at play here, they're applicable to any situation where you have two distinct groups competing for the same resources, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's land, food, even ideas.
So like any kind of cultural clash,
Yes,
essentially.
exactly. Any kind of cultural clash where one group's success might come at the expense of another. Think about the Neanderthals being replaced by modern humans, or the spread of new technologies during the Stone Age. Those could all be studied through this lens.
Wow, so it's like a new toolkit for understanding the past.
Exactly. And speaking of understanding the past, they didn't just stop at theory. They wanted to see how this model stacked up against real-world archaeological evidence.
Right.
So they picked three very different regions where we know this transition happened, each with its own unique set of circumstances. Denmark in Scandinavia, Eastern Iberia, that's roughly modern-day Eastern Spain, and the island of Kyushu in Japan.
Okay, so like a global test drive.
Exactly, a global test drive. And they found that the model, it did a pretty darn good job of replicating the population trends that we see in the archaeological record. It was like a virtual time machine, letting them see how these groups might have interacted over centuries.
So let's take those regions one by one. What did the model reveal about Denmark?
Well, Denmark is interesting because the archaeological evidence suggests a pretty long period of overlap between hunter-gatherers and early farmers. Maybe even over 1,000 years of interaction before farming really took over.
Wow, a slow burn.
Yeah, a real slow burn. And the model suggests that this gradual shift might be due to what they call demic diffusion, basically a slow and steady influx of farmers gradually becoming the dominant population. But it wasn't like the hunter-gatherers just vanished overnight. There's evidence of this extended interaction, this kind of cultural mixing going on.
Fascinating. Okay, so what about Eastern Iberia? What was the story there?
Eastern Iberia is where things get a bit more complex. Archaeologists often talk about a dual model for this region, meaning there were probably two things happening at the same time. Around 5600 BC, you've got some interaction and assimilation going on. Hunter-gatherers adopting farming, maybe joining those communities. And at the same time, you've got farmers potentially moving into areas that weren't so densely populated. So like a two-pronged approach to this agricultural spread.
Interesting. So like a mix of integration and expansion. And what did the models say about the pace of change there?
Well, compared to Denmark, the transition seems to have been much faster in Iberia. Like within a few centuries, farming was the dominant way of life, so a much more rapid shift.
Wow, that's quite a contrast.
Okay.
And finally, Japan. What was happening over on Kyushu?
Japan. This is where things get really intriguing. The evidence suggests that there were multiple waves of migration from the Korean peninsula, bringing farming to Kyushu. And these new arrivals, they probably interbred with the existing hunter-gatherer populations, creating this whole new cultural blend. But what's even cooler is that the archaeological record shows periods where farming actually slowed down, and in some cases, people even reverted back to hunting and gathering.
Whoa, hold on. So like back and forth between lifestyles.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't just this linear progression. There were these periods of experimentation, adaptation, almost like they were trying to find the best fit for their environment and their culture.
That's amazing. It really shows you how dynamic this whole process was, right?
Absolutely. And remember those key parameters we talked about earlier, the growth rates, the mortality, the assimilation? Well, by plugging in the archaeological data for each region, the model allowed the researchers to estimate those parameters for each specific case. And what they found was really telling. For example, in Denmark, the hunter-gatherers didn't seem to suffer as much from the presence of farmers compared to, say, Japan. But the farmers in Denmark, they had a higher growth rate, maybe because they were more mobile, spreading out and establishing new settlements.
So, like, different survival strategies, even within those broad categories of hunter-gatherer and farmer.
Exactly. And over in Iberia, the model suggested a similar story: lower impact on the hunter-gatherers, high growth rate for the farmers, probably fueled by migration. But in Japan, oh boy, that was a different story. The hunter-gatherers there, they seem to have been hit pretty hard by the arrival of farmers, and there was less cultural assimilation, a slower pace of change.
So Japan, it sounds like the decline of the hunter-gatherers was a major driver of the transition there.
Right. It wasn't so much about the farmers outcompeting them, but more about the hunter-gatherers facing challenges, maybe from disease, maybe from loss of resources, that really tipped the scales.
It's like each region had its own unique recipe for how this whole thing played out.
Yeah, and the beauty of this model is that it can capture that regional variation, those subtle differences, and how the ingredients combined.
Now, speaking of differences, what about the timelines? How long did it actually take for those farmers to become the dominant population in each region?
Well, there's quite a bit of variation there, too. In Iberia, based on the model, the transition seems to have been the fastest, maybe just a couple of centuries. In Denmark and Japan, the estimated time for farmers to become the majority, it was roughly similar. But in Denmark, those hunter-gatherers, they seem to have hung on for much longer, maybe even coexisting alongside the farmers for centuries.
So like a more gradual integration almost.
Yeah, a slower blending of those two ways of life. And in Japan, well, within the time frame they analyzed, the hunter-gatherers basically disappear from the model. But remember, this is just a snapshot in time.
Yeah, it's a constantly evolving story.
Exactly. And the big takeaway here is that this whole transition, it wasn't just about the environment, it was about people, right? Their choices, their interactions, their movements. And this new research, it's reminding us that we can't just look at those ancient bones and artifacts and assume it was all about climate or geography. We have to factor in the human element.
The human drama, the choices people made, how they adapted.
Exactly. And the researchers, they're calling for more archaeologists to use these kinds of models, these dynamic approaches to understanding the past. Because these models, they can help us connect the dots, see the bigger picture in a way that traditional methods might miss.
So for you, the learner, the big takeaway here is that the agricultural revolution, it was a messy, complex, multifaceted affair. It wasn't just about the environment, it was about people and their choices, their interactions, their migrations.
Right. And this study, it gives us a whole new toolkit for understanding not just the dawn of agriculture, but potentially any major shift in human history.
So here's a thought to chew on. If these principles of demographic interaction and competition apply to the agricultural revolution, could they also help us understand other major transitions, other cultural clashes throughout history, maybe even some of the challenges we face today? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning.
Keep learning.